James Heappey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I echo the words of my colleague in congratulating my honourable friend, Member South West Bedfordshire, on achieving this debate today. I agree with all that's been said about the need to do this. It's quite clear, in my view, that we have to do it to meet our carbon targets, which we've committed to, and because air quality is increasingly featuring in the public conscience too, and it may well be that court cases over air quality force the government's hand more quickly than our requirement to meet our carbon plans do. Our plans for emissions reduction by 2020 in transport are quite challenging already. The Energy and Climate Change Select Committee, on which I previously served, produced a report in which we looked at how government was progressing towards meeting those targets, and it was apparent that hitting the targets we'd set for 2020 was going to be very difficult indeed. The transition to biofuels will of course help, but there are real challenges in achieving that transition given the capability of some of the existing cars on the road. So quite obviously the quickest way to meet those targets, both for 2020 and beyond, is in the adoption of ultra-low emission vehicles. Now I think the technology is hugely exciting, and when the Select Committee visited California just before we finished in the process of compiling our last report, we visited Tesla, and when you see those vehicles, you come to understand that these are no longer golf carts or milk floats. These are proper cars that will really excite people the world over and undoubtedly will achieve significant saturation, even if the market is just left to its own devices. And a small plug, I'm delighted that Tesla are going to come and speak to the Globe APPG, which I chair in a few weeks' time, in order to explain their vision to colleagues here in Parliament. Other manufacturers, of course, are doing great things too. It's not just Tesla, but I've had the experience of seeing that factory, Mrs. Moon, and it really is very impressive what they're doing. Now, the argument for these cars, as I say, is absolutely compelling. They're not milk floats. They've got all the gadgets and oomph, I think is the technical term, that cars need in order to really sort of turn the heads of proper petrol heads. But also, they are amazingly cheap to run too. And I suspect that whilst, of course, the acceleration is now like a proper car and all the gadgets inside are like a proper car, it's the fact that you can now run for hundreds and hundreds of miles for pence that now makes the real difference. And I agree with colleagues that the existence of a second-hand market is really important too. And so I think where the government should focus its attentions, as my honourable friend for Taunton Deane so rightly said, is in really screwing down on the fleets to make sure that the fleets are aggressively encouraged to become ULEV fleets as quickly as possible, because invariably those fleets are only in fleet service for a very short time, a year or two, and it is them that filters through to the second-hand market most quickly. Now, I think there are three barriers, particularly to the rollout of electric vehicles, which the government needs to close with, and the Minister has heard me talk about these previously. But we need to get the charging network right. Now, this isn't the charging network on motorways and service stations on trunk routes, because undoubtedly in service stations all over the country you now see the electric charging points. Nor actually, I think, is it the charging network on driveways at people's homes, because the government's excellent grant scheme ensures that when you buy an electric vehicle, you can install a charging point on your private land for that purpose. The challenge is residential curbside, particularly in areas of particularly high population density. Go out in any direction from here and it will not be long before you find very high concentrations of people living with no private parking, and actually having a curbside charging network, probably buried in the curbstone, is an extraordinary infrastructure project for this to go ahead with. Of course.
My friend's making a very serious point, but is that not where these hubs I was mentioning could come in useful, so that you have a hub in various areas within the city, so you don't need to park and charge up on the curbside. You go there and you join it as on a membership basis, for example.
I'm grateful for the invitation. I too have had the pleasure of meeting with EV Hub, and their model initially is really to focus on the commercial fleets. I think the reality of the scale of the demand if every vehicle, when it left its parking spot each morning in order to go off, had to go via one of these hubs, would be unworkable. We have to find a solution to curbside charging for those who don't have off-road parking of their own. We also need to find a way of incentivising businesses to install EV charging points within their car parks at work. When we visited California, there were a number of businesses that made a great virtue of this, and in fact the charge on your car was free whilst you're in working during the day, and so actually finding a way of encouraging businesses to do that is very worthwhile. Secondly is the preparedness of the energy system itself. Quite simply, do we have the generation capacity to meet this likely increased demand in electricity need? Is the system smart enough? Sorry, is the energy system, the wires and switches, capable of dealing with the likely clusters in demand that will come from lots of EVs being charged in one street or one neighbourhood at one time? And is the system yet smart enough? Has it yet been digitised so that we can mitigate that clustering in both terms of time and space by load shifting so that cars are being charged when the energy is available at the cheapest possible point? We really risk exacerbating that peak price in the evening for energy if we haven't got that digitised load shifting capability in place, because when everybody comes home and lazily plugs in their car before they go inside, you've just massively increased demand alongside the switching on the kettle and the cooking of supper and all the other things that go on in homes when people first get home at night. And thirdly, Mrs. Moon, is people are going to need a certainty over the future tax regime for the way that we charge people to drive cars. It is blatantly obvious that Her Majesty's Treasury are not going to give up the receipts they currently get for fuel duty without wanting a compensating tax in place instead, and I suspect that's probably road pricing. Now, I think if we're going to really encourage people to go for electric vehicles, we are going to need to be very clear, perhaps in a green paper alongside the Modern Transport Bill, perhaps, what we are thinking about in terms of that alternative way of raising tax from motoring once we've lost the fuel duty that will go as people transition. Now, we can work through all of these, but what I think government needs to be very clear on is what its role is in encouraging the transition. The grants that are in place, I think, are doing an excellent job. People are being encouraged to look at EVs in particular because of the grants that are there. And the more and more that EVs come down in price and the more that they increase their range, crucially, the more that people will see them as viable and will be incentivised because of that grant being in existence. The size of the grants, I think, will be the indicator of just how serious the government is about facilitating this transition. But a plea, please don't penalise the driver of diesel cars, and I declare an interest as the driver of a diesel car, who thought we were doing the right thing in buying them, thinking that they were low emission and really efficient. We've got those, and we must now, if we are to be incentivised to transition away from them, the government needs to recognise that we didn't do the wrong thing by buying them. In fact, quite the contrary, we thought we were doing the right. Now, the transition is happening, the technology is compelling, and government intervention is the throttle in this process. But to meet the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, we must surely require the government to put its foot fully down on the accelerator.